sake of the word doing the heavy lifting on where you're going to get your marks and what you're saying. Do use the word if you need to use it to articulate something that you understand, but the value and where you're going to score comes from how it supports or feeds into the point that you're making. So don't just be like chucking the word axiological and epistemological and use these big words expecting them to do the heavy lifting. Your point does the heavy lifting, and use them if you need to convey your point, but not just for the sake of it. Yeah?
That was good summary.
Great. Awesome.
Okay.
We have one question in chat quickly. Let's after this get to whatever you have planned, but the purpose of learning about and understanding philosophy and sociology is to get us to think in other ways and consider things in new ways, not to necessarily explicitly talk about. Yeah, I think that point came prior to you saying that, but interestingly is a nice summary of what we were just talking about as well. Yes, Miho, that is exactly right. So the purpose of learning and understanding philosophy and sociology is to get you to think things in other ways, consider things in other ways, and your essays will be a reflection of the lump sum of your ability to, and how you genuinely do go about thinking about the world. So when you understand these things and apply them in your own time to consider how they implicate the world around you, once you've seen that, you talk from that and it will come out, it will express itself. But if you don't actually go and do the work of seeing how these things implicate the world around us, and you just talk about them, then it's going to be misguided, or you're going to sound like you're just making simple things complex. But I think that after today, after Nosh does take us through the chronology of how these ideas came to be and what kinds of ideas shape the world that we live in, we will have access to something, and we will then hopefully see the world in another way, and that will express itself spontaneously and creatively and naturally through our writing in 6 weeks' time or 8 weeks, however long your GAMSAT is.
Wonderful.
So
yeah, I was just going to say these are tools. Use philosophy, sociology, and different areas as tools to understand a particular quote. Just like mathematics, you're not showing mathematics in section 3, but you need it to answer questions. The other thing I was going to say was a lot of the readings that you do come across in section 2, preparing for section 2, understanding these subjects, you will see those kind of ideas and names in section 1 as passages. So you're actually studying for both 1 and 2, and it'll double up. Okay, so without further ado, what I'll do is I'll share my screen and try to get this. I couldn't save this file for some reason, so I was preparing it for everyone. We'll see how we go with time. Let me just, is everybody able to see the screen, I hope?
On that note, by the way, as far as time, so we're intending like, an hour and 15 or something, then a short break, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, and then come back for another hour. So hopefully we'll be done by 8:30, the latest, I hope. But I'm personally happy to stay on after that to answer any questions if people have them. But that's probably when the latest that the structured stuff will be done by.
So what I'm planning to do here is just bear with me with these ideas. And if you have any questions, please write them down, then ask me at the end of the class, because what will happen is if we get distracted with the questions and then answers will create more questions, we're going to go way off target. But I'm grateful to Michael that this time I got a chance to organize something for you. What I hope to do in the next hour and hour and a half is to go through a very quick summary, and it's very ambitious, of basically from the Ice Age to the iPad, right? Romp through intellectual history. And, from hunter-gatherer societies to postmodernism, what are these? How do we understand them? Who are they? But I'm primarily going to focus on Western civilization. And the reason being, we don't just have time to talk about the Eastern civilization as well. Not that the Eastern civilization or indigenous civilizations and others, which we will talk about a little bit, don't have any contribution. Absolutely, they do. Often there's an ideological drive that has existed in European civilization. When they teach us certain ideas, we forget the genealogy of the ideas and where they come from, that certain civilizations gave birth to other civilizations, often not taken into consideration. And this is one of the shortcomings of studying in Western universities. Nonetheless, let us continue our history of ideas. So the GAMSAT, section 1 and 2, 50% of it is based on the humanities and social sciences. And we talked about this last week. What are some of the humanities and social sciences? But really, it is about the study of human beings and culture through critical or speculative methodology. So what do I mean by critical or speculative methodology? Critical in the sense that when we do read, and there may be 3 levels of reading something, the first level is just understanding what the writer is trying to say. The second level is the reading between the lines. What is the writer meaning? So when you're reading a passage, when you're reading a quote or a proverb, what is the writer really talking about here, is conveying here beyond the words? And then the third level is the writer, whatever the argument the writer is making, is the writer wrong or right? Is it a strong argument? Is it a weak argument? Can we criticize the position that they're taking? And speculative methodologies in a manner, I guess, where we can't necessarily be 100% correct about everything. We need to speculate certain unknowns. We do speculative methodology, or we use it even in science. When it comes to theoretical physics, for example, we have to go beyond what empirical knowledge, what our 5 senses actually give us. So humanities and social sciences differentiate themselves from the natural sciences, where the natural sciences is based on empiricism, right? Empirical knowledge, the 5 senses. So the humanities we looked at was philosophy, language and meaning, religions, literature, visual and performing arts. In comparison, social sciences are sociology, anthropology, economics, politics, law, history, archaeology, etc. The reason I put etc. is because there are a lot more social sciences that exist. Some of them, for example, history, archaeology, is considered both a social science and humanities. And if you'd like to know more about this, please visit the video from last week. Yet we call these social sciences. Why are they sciences? And what does it mean that we have these sciences? So are you able to hear me all, by the way? Am I frozen? No? Okay. Just let me know if there's any sort of
You're all good,
data.
I'll let you know
Perfect.
what's going on.
Okay, frozen. No worries at all. So we call this social science, right? Why do we call it a social science? What's interesting is that since the advent of the scientific revolution, there was a particular school of thought that came about that said that science is able to answer all the questions of the world. And if we use science, then knowledge becomes better. And we're going to look into some of this as well. So as a result, economics used to be the study of economy, for example, political economy, which is about the wealth of nations. Then it became a science where you had to prove how to maximize profit or how to maximize distribution of goods and services using mathematics, right? Like, for example, I studied engineering maths when I was doing high-level economics, right, at university. Similarly, when it comes to sociology, we take questions and answers, social, questions that we have. And when we're studying sociology, they use qualitative and quantitative analysis, right? So it becomes a science for the society, right? Now, a lot of people say, well, why do we have to study this, right? Why do we have to study politics? Why do we have to study humanities? What I want to say is that nobody is independent of politics. Nobody is independent of philosophy, whether we like it or not. We may be thinking that, oh, I'm a free individual, yet it all affects us, right? This is, for example, the entire staff of, I think, Royal Melbourne or Royal Children's Hospital, when they did the protests saying that detention, mandatory detention of asylum seekers harms children, right? Why are they protesting? Because they are seeing firsthand the effects, psychological effects, physical effects, people taking their lives of mandatory detention, which itself is a law in Australian, legal framework, even though it goes against international law, which says that if somebody is a genuine asylum seeker and comes to your waters, you need to take them into your society. You have to take them in, right? So this is detention harms children. Once again, medical field engaging with politics. I think more than ever, we're seeing it today, where issues of mandatory vaccinations have become a political affair. If we lose medical freedom, we lose all freedom. These are all the American protesters that are against vaccines. It's quite interesting the way that Americans have been shaped according to their ideological framework and their history of what they understand freedom to be. I had a friend of mine who messaged me, believe it or not, and said, oh my God, Nosh, I heard all the crazy stuff that the Australian government's doing. They're apparently locking you up in homes. Whatever happened to these human rights of Western democracies, right? I heard there's lockdowns, and I'm going to go attend the protests in New York where they're protesting for the freedom of Australians, right? Who are apparently locked in houses. Quite interesting the way they think politically. I'm like, no, dude, I'm fine. I'm happy. I get to work from home. I don't have to wake up an hour earlier and so on and so forth. So it's quite interesting how all of this affects us and are part and parcel of our society. Another thing I wanted to say was, when you're doing medicine, it opens a lot of doors. Generally, in our age group or in our generation, we're going to have basically everybody changing their careers 4, 5, 6 times, right? You're not necessarily going to be in your area of expertise. So these are all doctors, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, Che Guevara, Franz Fanon, Sigmund Freud, but they're not as we know them, right? Leonardo da Vinci was an artist, he was a polymath, came up with many inventions, but he was also medically trained. Che Guevara, for example, was a Marxist revolutionary who fought alongside many revolutionaries, for example, in the freedom of Cuba, right? When we see Che Guevara, what he did was able to come up with amazing ideas, controversial ideas, but amazing ideas. But he was a medical doctor. Franz Fanon, once again, he was from Martinique originally, had a huge contribution in the study of decolonialism, in the study of racism. He wrote books like Black Skin, White Masks, right? Where people of color have to have a certain white mask in order to be accepted in society, right? Franz Fanon was a psychiatrist and studied psychology and psychiatry, and then was able to look into that. He also was a freedom fighter. He took up arms in the revolution against the French colonialists in Algeria at the time. Sigmund Freud, once again, father of modern psychology, came up with a lot of ideas of psychology, was also medically trained. So medicine, in its general sense, it's more than just clinical practice, right? Or evidence-based practice in science. It's about healing. The word healing and health have the same roots. So when we understand this, it's very important for us to go above and beyond the conventional understanding of medicines, drugs, pharmaceutical companies, right? Big pharma, huge political contention or huge sociological contention that comes in. So what I'll do is today, I'm going to quickly go through various civilizations and some of the ideas that they promote for us. The ancient, the pre-modern, the modern, and what we call the postmodern. Some say this is the age in which we are currently living. In terms of antiquity and the years gone by, we can see, for example, this is the map of Australia for the Australian context. I understand there are students from all over the world. If you look at the colonized world, all over the world, North America, South Americas, the Africas, Australia, etc., there were certain maps that existed prior to colonialism. So Australia was called Terra Nullius, right? No man's land. At the same time, there were over 300 languages that were being spoken that were wiped out as a result of European colonialism. This is the map that goes through the various language groups, very complicated and complex and sophisticated civilizational practices that existed at the time. If you want to know a story of survival, it's about Indigenous Australia, where we look at a civilization that existed continuously for over 50,000 years, right? And then in a matter of 300 years or 200 and something years or 300 years gets wiped out, right? Gets wiped out, lots of reasons: violence, settler colonialism, diseases, smallpox, etc. Similarly with the Americas and so on and so forth. But what's interesting, I find, is that there are certain laws that existed with certain mobs within Indigenous communities. You weren't allowed to marry from certain mobs or certain groups. There's this nature of understanding, their ontological view. What do I mean by ontology? It's the nature of existence. And their existential worldview was that there was this dream time, right, that had come to our world. And we were able to understand the land as something that is sacred. In the modern world and modern economics, land is understood to be an asset. We buy and sell land. The price of land increases. For many of the indigenous civilizations, and within Australia, the different cultural groups that existed, land was something sacred. It wasn't necessarily part of geography. It was part of history. It was part of philosophy. It was part of religion. It was part of a worldview. When, for example, they have the sand that's under their feet, all of a sudden, when a parent wants to teach a child, or an Aboriginal elder wants to teach a child, they start drawing. So the land becomes the classroom, the school, right? When you plant trees, it becomes, the source of food, for example. The land also is sacred in many ways. For example, there are sacred lands and spaces in different world religions. And Uluru Ayers Rock, for example, which they're finally banned to be able to climb, that's in Central Australia. These sort of spaces become extremely sacred, and we see a lot of tension. Recently, there were companies that were mining in sacred Aboriginal land, and some of the ways that they influence civilization is now being recognized so late in the game, after we had the devastating bushfires just prior to the pandemic, where entire Eastern Australia was burned down, literally from Queensland to Victoria. 1 billion animals died. 1 billion animals. Like, I remember watching it. I was in Turkey at the time, and watching just the koalas, the kangaroos. It was just horrific. We've forgotten a lot about it because of the pandemic, but the way that we don't look after the environment shows that there's something imbalanced about our society. There's something imbalanced about our civilization. This concept of balance, the indigenous peoples all over the world, the Aztec civilization, the Mayan civilization, you look at all the different civilizations, they understood it. They understood what balance meant. They understood what overconsumption meant, right? There was a famous philosopher from Cambridge who mentioned that the empires of North Africa, for example, and Iraq, they had tremendous amount of knowledge to be able to develop sophisticated scientific weapons, but they didn't at the time because they knew the harm that it would bring, right? The harm that it would bring to wiping out trees and water and human beings and children and others, right? What's also interesting is today we're learning, and after the bushfires, we started understanding indigenous practices of backburning that are now being used by CFA, Central Fire Authority, and other places where they were able to control regions and not be devastated by such bushfires, right? For example, let's continue on. I hope I'm able to go to the next slide. There we go. So this is really, we're talking about hunter-gatherer societies and then domestication of societies. And this is roughly 11 to 12,000 years ago from today, the ancient civilization. Check out the way that the civilization is, or the society is, right? The top left-hand side, we have waterways that are coming through. So access to running water is extremely important for human beings, right? We also see the domestication of animals. And what's interesting, excuse me, just one moment, I'm gonna close the door. So what we see here is the domestication of certain animals, right? And we also see how architecture, how nature was able to produce the homes that they lived in. Look at the way that what they're doing, for example, they're able to use agriculture, and this idea of you don't have to go through hunting and gathering necessarily. You can actually start planting crops and using those crops to be able to come up with bread. And that allows you to have a sedentary lifestyle, or a lifestyle where you're placed in one certain a village or a city or a town. Imagine you have to all the time, every year or every couple of years, move houses, right? For us who are students, for example, that's common semester-wise, but you are doing this consistently for the rest of your life, right? Moving from one place to another, moving during weather pattern changes, etc. So this was a huge shift. We start to see the way animals have been used for production of shoes, production of clothing, perhaps even instruments and tools, weapons, and so on and so forth, right? So from here, we start to see how knowledge actually gets drawn out and allows human beings to be able to flourish, When people are able to specialize in knowledge, and this specialization in knowledge comes in, people have competitive advantages, what's called, I forget the terminology now, but basically the idea that when you practice, practice makes perfect, you will be able to come up with more outcomes. You could be able to produce more because you're making that one instrument or one tool. Or somebody who's good at baking bread, you don't have to just do it for yourself, but you actually can do it for everyone else. And then trade starts appearing, right? Barter system, trading through currencies, or even debt. Right, one of the famous anthropologists, David Graeber, who passed away, is from the London School of Economics. He wrote a great book called 5,000 Debt, a 5,000-year history. And he says that actually our economies or our towns didn't begin with currency trading or even bartering. It began with debt, where you'd go to someone's house and say, hey, can I borrow some sugar, or can I borrow some flour? And then when their time came, they could ask for some back, right? So it's quite interesting that this happens. And there was a certain, sort of morality or ethics associated with this. There are amazing civilizations that existed. Like I remember having a Syrian neighbor, and they were narrating a story that their grandparents, often when they would go borrow sugar, for example, there were people that were wealthy that didn't need to borrow, and there were people that were not so wealthy. But even the wealthy people, just out of neighborliness, would go out and ask to borrow, for example, a very small amount of flour, a very small amount of salt, which has a very low nominal value, right? And the kids would ask the mother, why are you doing this? And the mother would say, I'm going to their house to ask to borrow this so that they don't feel bad when they come to ask me to borrow something, right? Imagine the level of ethics or morality in this sort of civilizations and societies, where you would ensure that your neighbors don't feel bad, right? It's not a competitive society. It's a very collectivist society. And so when we start talking about these ideas, and we look into the civilizations and societies, we look at, for example, the domestication of animals that did take place. And what's interesting is over 10,000 years we went through, we only were able to domesticate 14 animals, right? Not much more than that. And one of the reasons that we were only able to domesticate 14 animals is because we start seeing how wild animals cannot be domesticated, number one. They need to live from something that's very easy, for example, green agriculture, rather than eating other animals. And then we can use certain animals for our own good, right? This is the traditional uses of a buffalo, for example. Look at all the uses that they have. Waste, for example, was considered a underutilized resource. Today, in today's society, we have waste that's all over the world. And the way that the economy operates, or the way that our political society operates, is that, it's all about overconsumption, right? Advertising says, Mercedes-Benz, be the envy of your friends, right? Sprite, obey your thirst. It's always about tapping into our psychological positions that we may have some lacking, whereas traditional societies often used and utilized a complete resource, that we were able to see. So this really goes from the ancient civilization to what we consider pre-modern world, right? And a lot of the works of the pre-modern world, wisdom comes from it. Let's look at Mesopotamian civilization, for example. This existed at the time of, say, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And when we start seeing what Mesopotamia was able to produce, they came up with an amazing mathematical numerical system. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. Many people say, well, that comes from the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians. It's not true, actually goes back to Mesopotamia. Also, if we start looking at, for example, diagnosis, right? Prognosis, the medical system, or the medical way of treatment. Yes, the words are Greek, but they actually go back to Mesopotamia, and they were able to come up with amazing developments in technology as well. Irrigation systems, water storage, using of iron and bronze. And it becomes quite interesting in the way that we see how history is cyclical. Modern history is very much what we talk about is progressive, right? It's a linear way of understanding time. If we look at what the civilizations had and how they were not very different to what we have today. For example, ancient Egyptians, right? When we start to see their philosophy, when we start to see how they came up with what they came up with, it's very fascinating. It's not just in terms of, mummification and preservation, but also in terms of writing, papyrus, coming up with paper, black ink. The scribes were able to come up with amazing schools that existed. The way that they've actually calculated astronomy, right, is phenomenal. And the entire Middle East, why am I teaching this? The entire Middle East is part of the Western history. We may like to think that the Middle East is actually outside Europe and Europe is only Western history. Well, no. Roman civilization, for example, the Eastern Roman civilization included all of Turkey, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Syria, and other countries, right? And we start to see how these also affected Greek philosophy, which is where we start. Last week, we talked about, for example, the areas of philosophy. Now we're going to look at some of the schools of worldviews, right? So the Greeks and Romans, for example, were fascinating people, especially the ancient Greeks. When we look at the PreSocratic philosophers, the Milesians and the Eleatics were basically two schools of thought. Milesians believed that the whole world and how we understand the world, right, wasn't necessarily according to the periodic table, right, of elements and everything is made of atoms and molecules, but the whole world is made from constant change and chaos, that the whole world is in flux, yeah? And because everything is changing, the way we know if something changes is through sense experience, right? The five senses. And really, it's about the empirical worldview that was later adopted by modern science today. Yeah, Milesians talked about this. The Eleatics, on the other hand, believed that the world is in perfect order. That, for example, rain comes, it feeds, trees grow, fruits fall, we eat the fruits, and the cycle changes, and everything is in perfect order. And so they believe that in order to understand the order of it, is through reason, is through rationality. And that's why they're focused on logic and logos more so. During this time, there were political battles that were going on. And these political battles, for example, were not very dissimilar to today. We have right-wing political factions, we have left-wing political factions, we have the Labour Party, we have the Liberal parties, we have the Tories, the Conservatives in England, right? And a group of philosophers who were to be politicians said, look, it's not really about understanding whether the world is in chaos or the world is in order, or even understanding truth. What really we need is to convince people that this is true. Very, very similar to today's politicians, right? If you convince people that this is true, well, then they'll vote for you and they'll look up to you. And these were called the sophists because all they were doing is sophistry, yeah? And not really pursuing truth or pursuing wisdom. What philosophy is the love of wisdom. So we start seeing, for example, Socrates, who at that time had to face these people who were the sophists. And he came up with this idea to say that, no, actually, we can debate and there needs to be a true, and I will show you your logical fallacies and I will show you your hypocrisy, right? That you talk about something, but you actually present something else. And this is a way where the Socratic dialogues allowed us to be able to gather knowledge and to be able to present logic to the world. Plato, the student of Socrates, we don't actually have many of the writings of Socrates left, but Plato, for example, writes Socrates in his works. And Plato starts a school called the Academy, where he goes on to talk about issues of metaphysics and issues of epistemology and issues of ethics. And when he says what is good or what is beautiful is something that we can inculcate within us through virtues, then how do we do so in an ideal state where we want to create a society that is virtuous, a society that is beautiful? And this is really where Plato takes off and comes up with this idea of the utopia. He also says, for example, we mentioned last week, the allegory of the cave, where human beings really are about what society or how society shapes us, if we were told that this is real, for example, through media, and we don't really investigate ourselves through critical thinking and going through an entire journey of struggle, to be able to come out of that cave will be very difficult. In order to come out of the cave, you need to go through a journey. It's an intellectual journey. It's a physical journey for some. It's a spiritual journey for some, whatever it may be. It allows you to be able to go from that difficulty of ignorance and darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge. And this is what Plato talks about. And then we go back to help others, to teach, and to allow them to be able to flourish, and society and civilization to flourish. Plato's student Aristotle comes in. Plato talks about, in reality, the metaphysics is all about the realm of the forms. What does he mean by that? He says, for example, that everything that we see is actually a degree away from reality. For example, on Instagram, if I was to take a photo of my car and put it up there, that photo of the car is 1 degree away from the actual car itself, right? Plato says, for example, that everything that exists in this world actually originates in its form, in its perfection, somewhere in the heavens, right? Where the realm of the forms, or the category, or the idea of this, of a car, of a plane, of a house, exists in the metaphysical realm in its perfection, and we get an imperfected version in the material world. So that's why things don't last. That's why things are in change and flux. Aristotle, on the other hand, challenges Plato's ideas, and he says, well, no, actually, it's about materialism. What do I mean by materialism? It's about the worldview that in this world, there are certain causes and effects, right, that create what we do. It's not really about the realm of the forms, the unseen, but it's about how we understand natural philosophy through experimentation, for example. How do we understand ethical philosophy, right? It's about actions and doing things on this earth. There was another school of thought, the atomists. They believe that the world is made up of very tiny, indivisible parts called atoms. And these atoms would come into effect with one another to be able to create everything that exists, right? Sounds very familiar, right? Epicureans, for example, believe that the world is about, really, it's about beauty, and it's about love, and it's about happiness. And the best way to reduce that is to basically kill off all fear of death, right? And the greatest joy and the greatest happiness is the joy of existence, or the joy of living. The Pythagoreans, Pythagoras, right, as we study in high school, they believe the world is made up of numbers. And they said, well, the entire astronomical world, the cosmology, is made up of numbers. And so if we understand mathematics, we can actually understand the formula for everything that is around us, and we'll be able to understand our place in it. The numbers itself had almost mythical values, right? The Stoics, for example, said, well, if it's about increasing happiness and decreasing fear or harm, then what we need to do is to be independent of emotions, right? So you can imagine this amazing society where so many different schools of thought existed. And it would have been an amazing school where we see Plato teaching, and among the students were Aristotle, among others, right? So this is really the contribution to the Greeks' civilization. What happens with the Romans after them is that they inherit that. So you have Plato in Greek society, you have Plotinus, who is a Neoplatonist in Roman civilization.
And before we move on to Romans and the Stoics, I just want to take away from each part something that we can use in essays directly. So like, for example, so far from what I've heard, we've discussed the domestication of animals. I didn't quite get from that, though, something that I can take away explicitly and use, or what that teaches me about the world, or how I can use that in an essay. And then also equally, I'd like to, if you could just give a takeaway from the Greeks before we move on to the Stoics, so that each person in their mind, because that's a lot of facts or bits of information to keep in our mind. Can you make it explicit how from each section we can then go and take away just one thing, one bite that we can then either discuss in our essays or use in our essays?
Absolutely, yeah. So what I was going to do at the end actually was open it up for questions of how we can use these ideas, but we can do it in between.
not necessarily question. You can just take care at the end of every section before moving on to just leave one thing that can be taken away. So we can go, oh yeah, the Greeks, they said this, and the significance of that to the world today is this. And then we can write that down and move on.
Yeah, sure. So what we can do, for example, is say a topic comes up, any topic comes up. When we look at Greek philosophy, they teach us certain worldviews. When you have a worldview, no matter what topic comes up, you have something to say because you have a worldview based on that. Greek philosophical worldview, for example, Plato, if a topic like truth or beauty comes up, what we can say is Plato's idea of absolute truth and absolute beauty is something that exists outside this world. So when we can try to understand perfection in truth or perfection in beauty, it doesn't really exist in this world. Beauty fades, it's temporal. And this goes back to Plato, right? Another topic that may come up is happiness. We talked about happiness. Epicureans believed that life is really about happiness. That's the meaning and purpose of life. The way to do that is to reduce your harm and reduce your fear and maximize it. And the greatest happiness is the joy of existing. If you didn't exist, how would you experience anything else, right? They also talked about, for example, friends, having close friends to share this happiness with. It doesn't matter how much money you have. If you don't have any friends, you don't really get to experience and share that joy, etc. Michael, did you have any?
No, that's good. Yeah, if you can just at the end of every section do that, because for me personally, I don't know about the others, but for me personally, I understood everything in a vacuum there. But then when I heard you do that, I'm like, oh, that's how it can be applied. So for me personally, it was useful. I imagine as well. Thank you.
Absolutely, that's all right. The other example is the animals, right? So when we start seeing how human beings interact, like a question that came up in a GAMSAT, one of the task B essays was pets, right? How do human beings have pets? Well, firstly, you have to be domesticated. And also we need to be able to have a certain relationship with them. This allows domestication to happen. Think about zebras. It comes from the horse family. It's not a donkey, it's not a horse, it's a zebra. Yet donkeys and horse were able to be domesticated, right? Zebras weren't because they have a wild edge to them that's innate within them. So when we start thinking about this, how do we then imagine societies, say 500 years ago, where animals played a role, where human beings today, for example, go to a brainless, emotionless car and drive away. Back in the day, you used to be able to have that love that you would feel while you're in transport, right? That doesn't exist today. Today, it may exist if you're listening to a song, right? Spotify, or whatever it is you're playing, to get that emotional feeling. And so look at the way how these topics can be seen from different dimensions, right? And how we all tie them together. Okay. Should we take a break at 7 o'clock? I'll continue.
I personally have more steam left in me. Does it? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep going.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Let's continue.
Cool.
So once we start seeing the Greeks and the Romans, and what happens is the Roman civilization, Eastern Roman civilization, the Byzantium, which is modern day Turkey and Middle East, and you have the Western civilization, the Western Roman civilization, which included Spain, France, Portugal, Italy, and so on and so forth. The Romans took on these ideas of the Greeks. One of the schools, for example, the Epicureans had lodges where people would get together, they would eat together, they would live together, and they found great joy in that. They would do art, they would do music, right? Almost like in communes. And many of them were passed on to the Romans. And then later on, when Christianity became the official religion, Roman Catholicism, they became the monasteries, right, of European monasteries, for example, where monks would go to retreat, to meditate, etc., to teach, to study. And this all goes back to the Epicureans as well. Then what we start seeing in this sort of age, roughly you can say from 2000 or 3000 to about 1000 AD, 2000 BC to about 1000 AD, we start to see the rise of the Abrahamic faiths, right, that affect European Christendom, that affect the Muslim world in the Middle East, as well as the Judeo-Christian world and the worldview that they create. So this is really about Abrahamic faiths. Why do they call it Abrahamic? Because all three religions go back to the prophet Abraham. They generally believe in a monotheistic God, and they have a philosophy behind this, a theology, where they go and prove that God exists, right, using rationality and reason. They have ideas of the prophets, and then they also have almost a triune aspect, right, different aspects of this civilizations, theology, law, as well as spirituality, and they have an understanding of eschatology. Plato, for example, talks about a world prior to this world and above this world, the heavens and hell, for example. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they all show this, that there's an eschatology, there's a study of life after death, that justice, this pure justice, it exists, and there will be a judgment day, for example. And we also see their scriptures. So the Old Testament, the Tanakh, for example, in Judaism, that talks about the Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Chedim, the writings. The New Testament that exists, Bibles, the gospel, and so on and so forth. And it's important for us to understand the effect it has. Like, for example, the Bible is one of the most read books in the world, right? Constantly and continuously. And then what makes up that Old Testament? How do we understand virtue? How do we understand morality for, almost 2 billion people in the world who are Catholics or Christians or other denominations of Christianity? Similarly, the Quran and Islam, almost 1.5 billion people in the world are Muslim. We also have Hinduism, for example, in the Eastern civilization. Doesn't really belong to the West, but there are certain texts and scriptures that they look to. Old Testaments, for example, include Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, right? And so on and so forth. So we start to see the influence they had on morality, on life, on the way we understand trade and economics, the way we understand politics, the way we understand just a general worldview, right, that comes in. So if there is, for example, in the ancient civilization, we look at the Greeks and the Romans, and there's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. What we start to see here is that there is a grand narrative of a worldview. It's about ideas, it's about finding truth, it's about justice, for example, it's about understanding the world, right? And the greater civilization or the greater society is bigger than the individual. So if there is an essay on human nature, you can actually look into how all these sort of ideas play what is natural for the human being, right? One of the German anthropologists, Wilhelm Schmidt, I think his name was, did an amazing study of anthropological civilizations. And he found that each and almost every civilization had this idea of a religion or idea of divinity. So he concluded that human beings are homo religiosus, right? The religious animal. We're not just a rational animal because we have the intellect. We're not just a laughing animal. We're also a political animal and a religious animal and an animal that is able to create civilizations, right? So that is something that you can always throw in, no matter what type of essay comes in. You can actually relate human nature and the human being to that topic, whether it's a personal piece, whether it's a social piece, because it's all going to come under the humanities, right? Understanding the human being. And this sort of takes us to the idea of modernity or the modern age. The modern age is interesting because it has certain, you can say, elements to it, to society. And this element is really about the individual or the self, right? What do I mean by the age of the self? Let's have a look here. Before I do, I wanted to quickly go through the world map and how we understand modernity. So when we start talking about the rise and fall of civilizations, there were great civilizations.
Your I think your internet's breaking out.
India and China and Japan.
Hey guys, sorry about that. While he's getting sorted, just answering a question that was in the chat about who are the Greeks and who are the Romans. So Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle were the Greeks. The Romans are the Stoics. I'm not sure where the Epicureans fall. We might have to ask Nosh about that when he's back. Epicureans. It was one he discussed second. Epicureans. Epicurean is Greek as well. He's cut out. So while we have some time, does anyone have any questions? Oh, there you are, Nosh.
Sorry about that.
That's right, man. Your internet was cutting out. Well, I've asked anyway. Does anyone have a question before we move on? No. All right, cool. Just to
someone else gone.
Yeah, no, go Harry.
I was just going to ask just a bit of clarification with the Epicureans, Nosh. So you say that they kind of believe that the meaning and the purpose of life is like happiness and love and beauty and so on. And is their aim to actually reduce fear and pain so that they can enjoy it more? Or is it more dependent on fear so that it gives that happiness and love more meaning?
The aim is to visibly and actively reduce fear.
Okay.
Because by reducing fear, you're able to maximize happiness.
Yep. All right. Awesome. Thank you. I just want to start off with a dependency thing, but no, please out. Cheers.
Nosh, you might need to hotspot, bro. It sounds like your internet's not doing its job.
Sorry.
No, Esha.
Yeah, so I had a quick question on Stoics. I think you said we need to be independent of emotions to experience happiness. Like, I not be scared and have fear. But I was wondering how that was compatible.
I think Nosh is coming in and out, so this is a basic understanding, but I think where the Stoics are coming from is they're prioritizing ration as a value and objectivity and the ability to be dispassionate. So that's not to say don't be emotional or don't have emotions in the sense of don't feel or be cold, but it does mean I suppose, control your emotions, not let your emotions control you. Marcus Aurelius was a particularly good or a particularly notable Stoic commentator. Who said, for example, a stone thrown up, nothing good for it on the way up, nothing bad for it on the way down. So it's about cultivating an awareness of, I suppose, how emotions and our responses to things oftentimes frame and are responsible for how and why things either objectively go wrong or seem to go wrong for us. Whereas having I suppose, a more dispassionate view and allowing things to come and go allows you to be less moved by life, and for the Stoics, that is a value. And a good story that exemplifies this goes something along the lines of, it's like a farmer's son was out catching wild horses, and he caught 40 horses and he brought them back, and the neighbors said, "Oh, what good luck." And he said, "Oh, is it so?" And then the next day, one of the wild horses bucked him off and he broke his leg, and everyone said, "Oh, what bad luck." And he said, "Oh, is that so?" And then the next day, the army came to conscript all the village boys, but he couldn't go because his leg was broken. And they said, "Oh, what good luck." And he said, "Oh, is it so?" And it goes on and on. The point being that you never really know all the strings and permutations that come off various actions or situations, and that for a Stoic is not only a virtue, but an access, I would say, to a richer or more meaningful, or at a minimum dignified experience of life and expression of self. I don't know if that was too wordy, did that?
No, that was good. It was good.
Thank you.
I was just filling in until the real teacher comes back. I think I did it right, though. I wish you had heard that, Nosh. I think you might even have agreed.
Michael's being overtly humble. Michael's my teacher, so.
Oh, I wish. Anyway, let's get back to it. Remove pin. All right, floor's yours, bro.
I apologize. I think something was happening. I don't know if it was Netflix in the next room, but I told everyone at home to stop using the internet for half an hour.
Now, one sec, maybe probably microwave oven could interfere.
Yeah, microwave ovens as well. That happens in my house.
Someone uses at the time, it would
play up. You're absolutely right, Raj. Let's get back to it. I've lost my train of thought. Okay, so modernity is quite interesting because not everybody agrees when it began, right? But just prior to modernity, we see the rise of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and it becomes quite interesting because if we have a look at the city of Baghdad right, in modern day Iraq. There was, for example, some of the oldest universities that existed in the world in Iraq, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and Morocco. There was a place called the House of Wisdom, in Arabic, Beit al-Hikmah, where Jewish philosophers and thinkers, Christian philosophers and thinkers, Muslim intellectuals, as well as Zoroastrians and Sabians and others from India would come and discuss ideas, intellectual ideas. Many of them translated the works from the Greek into Arabic. A huge project. And really here in the Middle East, and you can say the Persian-speaking world, Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Iran, they were able to bring in the wisdoms of the Hindu tradition, mathematics, philosophy, and others, the Chinese civilization and Buddhist civilization, as well as the Greek civilization. And they were able to work together. Doctors in 10th century, 11th century Baghdad were removing cataracts, doing cataract eye surgery, right? We see the work of Avicenna, or Ibn Sina's work on physiology, anatomy that was used for 1,000 years until Gray's Anatomy replaced it. So we see this amazing civilization that was developing in Iraq and the Arabic-speaking world from south of Turkey all the way to Morocco. And what happens is that Spain and Portugal at that time was called Andalusia. Andalus is one of the southern, for those who've been to Spain, one of the southern states is Andalus. It was an amazing civilization, right? City of Cordoba, city of Granada had huge amounts of libraries. At a time when the Europe was in dark ages, many used to come and visit and study in Spain. So today we have international students, for example, going to UK, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, the Ivy League schools to get the best education possible. At that time, the royalty of Europe and Middle East used to go to, for example, Spain to study. And what happens here is that there is a very famous philosopher by the name of Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, who they call the little Aristotle. He really develops this idea of Aristotelian philosophy and Western understanding of science that then gets spread all across the Middle East, Europe, and beyond, if I can say that. So it's a really interesting time that just before the European Renaissance, we start to see, cities and countries, islands here like Malta and Cyprus and Sicily that are really intellectual hubs in many ways. And then what we see here is that when the European royalties to come to Spain and study, they used to take obviously the ideas back, just like what's happening today, right? Chinese international students or Indian international students come and they go back and they create robust economies, businesses, and so on and so forth. Similar things were happening in Europe at the time. And really, roughly around 1470s, you have what was called the Spanish Inquisition. By 1492, the war ends. In the Spanish Inquisition was the North African and the Andalusians who were there versus the French and the Northern Spanish who used to come and fight against one another for political battle. For lack of time, I'm just going to summarize it here. And it's a fascinating part of history that, if you've been to Granada, you look at Alhambra, for example, it's one of the most visited places in the world and the top European destination. You can start to see how running water, for example, were used in civilization, irrigation, but also in architecture. It's phenomenal. The point I wanted to make here was that reading these books that were published in the Middle East and North Africa were then able to produce the European Enlightenment and Renaissance, right? The intellectual history goes back to it. And so if I was to go to the next slide, this is quite an interesting slide because it basically sums up all the events that happened in rough succession. In 1492, when Spain or Andalus falls, there is an Italian sailor who wanted to make a career out of himself and left Italy. To be honest, he was a bit of he's part of the riffraff and the government wanted to get rid of him. He went to Spain to get a new citizenship because Spain was a new country. His name was Christopher Columbus. And Columbus sailed to the Americas with navigators. Funnily enough, these navigators, prior to Christopher Columbus going there, knew that there were other lands and other countries, because the Kingdom of Mali and the Kingdom of Ghana, for example, people had actually sailed to the North Americas. So when you go to the North Americas, they're still finding, for example, 9th century coins from Iraq, right? Because people were actually trading, and some of the West Africans did go over to North America. So when Christopher Columbus went there, he said he didn't discover shit, excuse my language, but there were already people living there, right? Ancient civilizations that were there, obviously American Indians, as they're called, the Native Americans were there, and they also had very strong moral system, political system, social system, wisdoms, right, that had existed, and they had their own philosophy and understanding of the world and worldview. But this becomes a remarkable event, 1492. Why? Because this is, quote unquote, the discovery of the New World. Prior to that, it was just 3 continents. So when we start seeing how this Spanish philosopher Averroes, right, was in Spain, in Andalus, or Spain and Portugal. Also, there were figures like Ziryab, Ziryab. This guy was like, he was the sort of celebrity of his era. Yeah, he's the one who came up with different fashion styles for summer and winter. He came out with shorter hairstyles. Back in the day, in the Middle Ages, everyone used to have long hair. So it's quite interesting how fashion gets influenced from this period as well. He came out with this idea of an entree and a main course and a dessert, right? So very interesting the way that I think they said that he also developed the guitar, the modern guitar, different from oud that used to be played back in the day. So you can see this cultural, intellectual, scientific phenomena that comes out of Andalusia, out of Portugal and Spain, that then affects modern Europe as we understand it today. Around the same time that this was happening, there was growing animosity within Europe against the Islamic empires, right? Primarily because, you have this sort of superpower that can engulf everyone. It's like America, right? It's engulfing everyone. There's going to be anti-Americanism. So this existed right at the doorstep of Europe, where they were literally surrounded by North Africa, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire that was rising, Russians that were, on the other side of them. So Europe wanted to really make bold statements. There were wars that took place, and Spanish Inquisition is one of them. When we start looking into the modern world, we start looking at some of these dates. The way that the New World comes into our space in 1492. So really you can say that 1500 onwards is where this new world begins, world that we understand it as today. And there were some events that happened, some revolutions that affect the way that we think, the way that we are today. One of them being Copernican revolution. So Nicholas Copernicus is accredited for the idea of heliocentrism. What do we mean by heliocentrism in comparison to geocentrism? That the world is not in the center of the universe, rather it's the sun that is in the center of the universe, or center of our solar system, and the earth happens to revolve around it. Now, this was a huge discovery. Why was it a huge discovery? There were others in ancient Greece, in Roman times, in the Islamic Empire, who said that the sun is actually in the middle and not, it's heliocentric worldview. But it was a huge issue because they were able to then scientifically prove that this is true by Galileo Galilei, who took up this as Copernicus died. And this really eventually led on to the scientific revolution. Before Copernicus said that heliocentric world existed, everybody for roughly 2,000 years in Europe believed Aristotelian position that the human beings are somewhat amazing. We're in the center of the universe, and allowed us to be, inhabiting a place, planet Earth, which was, sort of God-given. And that allowed us to be able to be special and compared to the astronomical cosmos, right? Copernicus comes in, and all of a sudden people are saying, well, hang on, this is beyond the Bible. We can actually use our senses that may contradict some of the truths that were revealed to us. this leads on with the scientific revolution, as we see, for example, Francis Bacon from the 1600s, Isaac Newton in the 1700s, and scientific revolution becomes
Can I just quickly
power.
jump in?
Yeah.
I just want to highlight to everyone, I would like you to pay particular attention to this, because these are tangible things you can touch, refer to, date, reference. And as Nosh said, this is the beginning of the new world, the world as we understand it today. These ideas in particular can be attributed for many of the things in the world the way it is today being the way that they are, and an awareness of where we came from, and how that results in some of the things that you might discuss in your essay, something that's going to allow you to shine through as a student. So these things in particular, revolutions, dates, I'd like you to pay particular attention to, and develop a finesse with being able to reference and discuss easily. Anyway, sorry to cut you off, Nosh.
That's all right. That's all right. What I'll do is I'll just type up the dates for you so that you don't have to search them up. So the New World's 1492, Copernican Revolution. I think Copernicus dies. Let me look it up.
Thanks, Nosh.
It's all right. 1543. What else is there? The Cartesian Revolution or the Scientific Revolution. Scientific revolution, they say, actually starts in the 1540s. So you can say that this is where it really starts. What happens is, I mean, if you look really deep into it, when we were studying history and philosophy of science, it takes me back to uni so many years ago, Nicholas Copernicus dies as his book is being published. And then Galileo takes this up, and the church is like, dude, you got to stop talking. Don't mention this. He's like, look, I have looked through the telescope, and there are, there are rings around Saturn, there's moons around these planets that are also moving. And Galileo Galilei basically becomes the first martyr of science, right? They kill him because of his scientific beliefs, just like Socrates was the first martyr of philosophy. And then we've also got the sort of Cartesian revolution. This is by René Descartes, and we'll talk about René Descartes, who lives from 1596 to, I think it was, Cartesian revolution is roughly around 1596 to 1600. Then you've got the Industrial Revolution, and Industrial Revolutions in the 1700s, right? 1760, some say, onward. Then you've got the sort of liberal revolutions, and this is like the French Revolution. The French Revolution.
Can I get you to chuck in as well? We can't have it on the slide, but I think it's relevant depending on where you're going to go. But the Russian Revolution, 1909, I think, January 9, 1909. The overthrowing of the Winter Palace. And so how that gives rise to socialism and Marxism and the spread of the Reds and the domino effect versus America and liberalism and democracy is...
So what I'll do, perhaps I'll cover 20th century in more detail according to the decades, and I'll go through some of that as well. And then you've got sort of imperialism, which starts, occupying the world.
I really want you guys to pay attention to this. This is like gold.
Justified through racism, and this happens really it happens earlier. It actually happens from 1500s onwards, but this is more so 1700s to the 20th century. Sorry about the typo. Imperialism. Empires, basically. Imperialism. There we go. So we start to see how one thing happens after another and how one thing affects another. How are we going with time? 7:25. Pressure is on to finish. Copernican revolution comes in, and this becomes extremely interesting. One, because all of a sudden the world that was actually justified through religion, this sort of feudalistic worldview that we understand. Sorry, I don't know why the image is so small. I wanted to get it bigger. But this was the sort of feudalism that we were talking about. There was a king who was on top in Europe. You have your lords, your vassals to the king. You have military aid. Then you had the knights that would come in. Some of the traders were actually here as well in the middle class. And then you had the serfs, the slaves, and others. And this system was justified by the church. So it becomes quite interesting. Let me just perhaps switch over quickly to the Zoom whiteboard, hey? Just so I can quickly show you. Okay, so we see this sort of massive triangle that exists, right, in terms of power. We can have the king and the queen, etc. On top, you have the middle class, right, the vassals, excuse my bad handwriting, the knights, and you have the serfs, the plebs, as they were called, slaves, etc. And really, all this entire system that existed was justified by the church. Yeah, so the role of religion played. And what was interesting is the king had absolute power, right? Complete and total domination of power. When this power was there, everybody, for example, had to pay their taxes to the king. Huge amounts of money. Yeah. If they weren't able to pay taxes, they were always in debt and in arrears to be able to pay to the king who had absolute power. What does absolute power look like? People were not allowed to speak against the king, right? Or their head would be taken off. So there's no such thing as like a freedom of speech, yeah, that comes in. There was no equality because people had their own societies. If you're noble birth, you belong somewhere. If you weren't noble birth, you belong somewhere. You can't actually come up with a tech startup and move up the chain quickly, right? So this is what we mean by feudalism. There was absolutely no equality in society. People didn't have any rights, right? There were no rights. The idea of human rights. If the king wanted to say, okay, well, I like this woman, she's a wife of someone else, the king was able to take her for a night. Yeah. As I mentioned, high taxes were given, where the middle class, for example, that were here, many of them did trade and they were doing businesses. And at this time, businesses were opening up because the new world opened up, new markets opened up, and trade became a huge deal. Trading of spices from South Asia, trading of rubber and wood and so on and so forth from Congo and other places. So resources and trade, they were using competitive advantage to be able to manufacture goods and services, make them through trade. And the middle class became extremely wealthy. They had a lot of market and purchasing power, but they didn't have a lot of political power. Yeah. And the society was very strictly structured, if you can call it. It's a structure. Yeah. So there's no equality, there's no freedom, there's no rights, right? And as a result, there's no justice. If the king wanted to say something, he could say it and make it a law, and it was the king was above the law, right? And additionally to that, religion, according to the church, actually justified this system of power because, well, if you were going to go out and speak against the king, this was going to be sacrilegious because king is the appointed God's vicegerent on earth. Very fascinating society. Yeah. As you can see, the middle class at that time had money and they wanted to make business, but they weren't able to be treated equally. They didn't have rights. So what happens is that this eventually leads, and I'll just clear the screen, or I'll save the PDF, PNG, done, and then I'll clear the screen. I'll share it with everyone. What happens is, as a result, we have, in political terms, the liberal revolution. Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry. Where are we? Eraser. There we go. The liberal revolution is quite interesting because today we say that, well, we live in a liberal democracy. Well, what the hell does that mean, right? A liberal democracy. What is the idea of liberal that comes from a political philosophy of liberalism mean? Yeah. I'm just going to take a quick tangent here just so we can understand this. Liberalism said, okay, to hell with this feudalistic system that's structured, that has no equality, no rights, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a society where the individual matters, right? The individual matters. And it's above and beyond the structure of the society. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you're poor, whether you're, a refugee, whether you're Black, you can still be an American president. Yeah. So this sort of idea of individualism starts coming in the age of modernity. And prior to that, or just as this sort of tension is happening, this is in sociology what we call structure, agency, paradox, or problem, right? Are individuals who are here, do they have agency? Or is society really structured? Is the structure of a society influencing us, or do individuals have the right to change and shape society? For the liberals, they said, no, we want to change society. We want to have liberty. We want to have freedom. Yeah, this idea of freedom that Americans go on about is here that really starts, right? French Revolution, the right to liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, and so on and so forth. Freedom itself can be, as I mentioned earlier, freedom from or freedom to, right? This is a negative and this is a positive. When we start seeing some of these ideas of freedom from, freedom to, we start to see what it means. So for example, I'm able to do whatever the heck I want. Like we often say, Scandinavian countries, oh, they're so liberal, aren't they? What does that mean, that they're liberal? It means that marijuana, for example, is legalized, that they can go, I don't know, skinny dipping or whatever they want to do is legalized, right? They have certain values that are not conservative, that are liberal in the sense that they're seeking freedom to do A, B, and C, and it's not criminalized. At the same time, we want a society that is equal and has elements of equality in it, because they found that feudalism was not equal at all. And this idea of equality that existed at the time is what we can see is equality in terms of means and not in terms of ends. Yeah, means, not ends. What do I mean by means and ends? Means that everybody has an opportunity equally. So that's where this term equal opportunity comes from. Whereas ends is everybody is the same. So for example, socialism, communism, those sort of ideologies is it doesn't matter how much money you have, you can only buy one car or two cars, right? And those cars have to be state sanctioned, right? So it's not about the quality. Like when you work and you earn more money, you don't get necessarily better quality of life because you need to share that with everyone. So this is equality in terms of ends and equality in terms of means. What's also interesting is there is this idea of meritocracy that comes in from equality, meritocracy, and this was one of the essay topics in the GAMSAT in the past, versus what's called affirmative action. This was also an essay topic in the past, about 10 years ago, where we look at, okay, if everyone has equality in terms of opportunity, then we can judge a society by how much merits somebody has. Somebody will get a scholarship based on whether they're intelligent enough, they're hardworking enough. However, there are structural, remember we were talking about structure and agency? There are structural inequalities that exist. And these structural inequalities mean that the opportunity that's given to those that are in private school don't belong to those that are in remote, rural public schools. This is why some people who are sitting the GAMSAT or, when they're entering medical school have additional points, right? Favoritism. That's not equal, is it? No, but it's about affirmative action. Yeah, there's special scholarships for Indigenous people. There's special scholarships for African Americans, for example, because to address the structural inequalities that were produced. Then we look at, for example, the idea of rights. When we talk about rights, the language of rights, human rights, animal rights, women's rights, minority rights, minors' rights, voting rights, the right to one phone call, and on and on and on, actually belongs here with this liberal individual, that the individual needs to have certain rights protected within a political society, right? And those who are talking about human rights is very much a liberal framework. Then you've got something like justice, which wasn't there during feudalism. And this justice, primarily, when we talk about justice, in the liberal framework, it's Rawlsian justice. There was a philosopher by the name of John Rawls from Harvard University, And he said justice really is fairness. He writes a book, Justice as Fairness. And he talks about that when we treat someone, we need to be able to treat them with justice that is independent of whether we like them or not, whether they're related to us or not, right? This idea of being blind, right? When we adjudicate, being blind from prejudice, yeah. And also the individual, because in the previously we were showing how feudalism was justified by religion and the church system. They said to hell with church, we don't want a state-sponsored religion. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to have secularism and secular values, which is this idea of church and state being independent of one another. But in reality, while they talk about church and state independent of one another, they have a state system and the state apparatus that goes above and beyond to control the church, right? And really, it begins with individualism, this idea that every individual has their own way of thinking. If you compare that to collectivist cultures, Asian cultures, African cultures, Latin American cultures, where they live, for example, under the same roof 5 generations, where the family is very much involved, to the extent where uncles and aunties have a say to who they're marrying, right? Not just your parents, not just, they're outside families, very different from individualism in Western cultures, where you move out and you tell your parents, right? Whereas in other cultures, no, your parents decide when you move out. So it becomes very different way of looking at society. But here we run into a lot of problems. Like, for example, where does my freedom start and where does my freedom end and someone freedom starts? So for example, if I was moving my arms around and I'm close to someone, I can actually hit someone, right? They have the freedom from being hit. I have the freedom to move my arms around. At this injunction, for example, between freedom to and freedom from, let me just change my color. We have this idea of tolerance. Once again, was another essay topic that came up in the past in the GAMSAT. Tolerance can also be positive and negative. What do you tolerate? You tolerate alcohol, drugs, right? You tolerate bad people and their behavior. So when you say, oh yeah, we need to be more tolerant society, we need to tolerate asylum seekers, what are you saying, really? Right? You need to be more hospitable, right, to asylum seekers. You need to be able to go above and beyond. So tolerance has both positive meaning and a negative meaning. And here we look at each and every single one of them. For example, equality in terms of means, equality in terms of ends. Ends is very much Marxism, right? Everybody needs to be equal. Means is very much liberalism, meritocracy and affirmative action. Some people say, well, no, we need to address structural inequalities. And each one of these, there are problems. For example, we talk about human rights. Okay, human rights are a great thing. But then at what point does human rights impinge on other areas of justice? Is human rights, does a country have the right to be not bombed, for example, because their nation state is sovereign? Then what about when, for example, America bombs Iraq or Afghanistan, right? And Australia takes part in that. Can then we take the leaders of America, Australia, and UK, Tony Blair and others, to the International Court of Justice or not? What happens when justice is somehow problematic in the creation and construction of laws, right? An example that comes to mind now is that you can create laws that are anti-racist, right? Everybody's equal. But when racism goes beyond legal and it's actually a personal issue, then no matter what laws you create, it doesn't really allow you to be able to sue someone just because, say, for example, just because you didn't get a job or you didn't get a scholarship as a result of sexism or racism. How can you prove that, right? So there are a lot of limitations to this. Similarly with secularism, if the state controls the church or controls in a multicultural society, in globalization, where there is a global monoculture, religion's being controlled, right? multicultural societies, we have different religions. At what point can the state intervene? Because we also need religious freedom, right, from the government. So all of a sudden, we start to see a liberal society that's not so easy and not so great, but also very complex, right? Because religious freedom can be impinged upon if, and this is actually interviews, medical interviews comes in here when you're applying. One question has been about Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Jehovah's Witness, they believe that you can't have a blood transfusion. You're working in the ED, somebody walks in and they're from that particular church, JW, they can't have a blood transfusion. What do you do? Yeah. So all these questions come up and play into our society. Let me just switch back to the slide pack. Do you have any questions, by the way, comments?
Nosh.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could repeat what you were saying about justice and law. Like you articulated really well, but I didn't get a chance to write it down.
That's all right. So the justice for liberals is about fairness. Yeah, justice as fairness. Laws are often created by people in power. So we have, for example, in our legal system, we have two types of law creation. We have statutory law that comes through statutes, and in the parliament, it needs to go through upper house and lower house, right? The senators and the House of Parliamentarians, or in the UK, they call it House of Lords and so on and so forth. And then we have case-based laws. Case-based laws is when you have a certain case that is a landmark case because it creates a precedence for other laws or other cases. Yeah. So in this society, we have statutory law and case-based laws, and legal systems are constructed on like this sort of liberal framework. But often laws are not enough, are not sufficient to be able to address problems in society. So you can create a law that says you're not allowed to be, you're not allowed to assault someone, maybe your partner. This is a law against domestic violence. Yet domestic violence still happens. Why? Because there may be a psychological or a personal issue with the individual, right, that needs to be reformed in order to stop this issue. Similarly with racism or sexism or other areas. This is where, if you were to look at the study of critical race theory, I don't know if you've heard of it, CRT, critical race theory, they look into this where they say that why is it 50 years after civil rights movement, after Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all these people that gave their blood for fighting against racism, why do we still have such disparity in America between races, right? Still to this day, you go to certain states in the South, public schools, not private schools, public schools have formals or proms, year 12 formal or year 12 prom, where they have segregated, one for the blacks, one for the non-blacks, right? Still to this day, 21st century we're talking about. This is not in the 60s. So when we start talking about this, when we start dealing with it, why is it that the law is insufficient to deal with this issue? And this was a question that came up. And so critical race theory looks at it, at this issue, and talks about the psychology or the psychosis of racism, right? Or misogyny, and so on and so forth. What is it within our minds that we construct? And when we see someone, we automatically think, oh, they must be intellectually inferior because they speak English with an accent. They may not be as smart as us, right? So all of these come into play when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about power, when we talk about liberal societies. You know how Orwell says, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. There's always that element of some are more equal than others that come into play. Yeah. So in terms of the laws, we have certain laws and they don't necessarily allow us to fix something in society. Is that okay, Wadia?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Let's go back to what we were talking about. So you start seeing this sort of liberal revolution. You know what? I'll quickly mention one last point on the whiteboard, just so you understand how this relates to everything else. Let me just save this. So as you can see here, the middle class was uprising and they had a liberal revolution to be able to overthrow the society and live in a liberal democracy. The problem with that was, let's just clear screen. The problem with that was that as the middle class was rising up, right, and improving their wealth, power, status, they started having factories, mass production, an industrial revolution came in, etc. Consequently, they hired a lot of people, laborers, yeah, and the laborers, their wages were very low. There were no rights, yeah, and because there were no rights, there was a lot of exploitation was going on. Yeah, Charles Dickens, for example, talks about Oliver Twist, the novel. If you've seen the movie or have read the novel, Oliver Twist is an orphan who's working in the factories. Child labor was rampant, as is today in places like Bangladesh that are making clothes for us from H&M, or Indonesia that have Nike factories, right, make our runners. Child labor becomes rampant, right? There's no rights for workers. So Karl Marx comes in and says, well, middle class has all the capital, right? And the labor class own all the labor. So this system that liberalism has created is called capitalism because it's about those who control the wealth, right? Capitalism. And Marxism says, well, we need another revolution. That revolution needs to come from the working class when they have certain consciousness, instead of false consciousness, this idea, oh, I've got a job, therefore I have access to money, therefore I'm going to live a good life. Well, guess what? The society is actually unfair, unjust, creating more disparity between rich and poor. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a revolution, and a revolution where everyone's equal, etc. So socialism comes out of this. Communism is the ultimate goal, right? This sort of liberalism, there's also another one that comes in, and this is really, you can say, modern liberalism. So if this was the classical liberalism, which is against feudalism, then modern liberalism comes in here. And what does modern liberalism say? They say, look, classical liberalism was basically anti-government. They're saying, F the government. We want equality, we want rights, we want freedom, we want justice, right? We want secularism. Modern liberalism says, well, no, the government actually has a role to play and the government should intervene. How should it intervene? How should it intervene? It should actually put taxes on the wealth, right? So that we can create a social security system that is able to provide the people who don't have much, right? The government should intervene to control some of the rights or to punish, right, bad bosses, right? Bosses. The Marxist agreed to some of this, right? And they said, well, okay, we need to also come up with unions. And so the union movement started where people, workers would come together and to be able to collectively bargain with employers, with corporations, with companies to set certain days off. Instead of working 7 days a week, they said, no, we want 2 days a week off. And the government should come up with laws where we can have a weekend, right? The concept of weekend begins. We need to have 38-hour work weeks. After that, we need to get paid overtime or bonuses. So overtime or bonuses come in, or time in lieu comes in, right? So you have these Marxist thinkers, you have modern liberalism, and also there are those who are conservative. Edmund Burke, for example, who talks about the role of religion. And he says, well, why are we living in such a progressive, liberal society? Religion can play a good role in society where we do give charity, where we do help others, where we look after our neighbors. And this is this idea of conservatism that started, conservatism, that we want to conserve the old system, the good values of the old system. So we have liberalism as a political ideology and reactions to that as Marxism, which ends up with socialism and communism. Modern liberalism, conservatism. For the lack of time, I'm not going to go into in depth of what they are, but it allows you to at least understand how they all fit together. So if terms come in, now you go, oh, okay, well, this is all political ideologies as a reaction to one another, and this is how they come about, right? I'm going to save this and I'll put it up on Facebook as well. Let's go back, because I'm running out of time. Let's go back to sharing screen. How are we all doing? Have I lost anyone? Interesting, boring, good? Excellent. Cool. So now that we're looking into various revolutions, we have the scientific revolution, right? And we talked about that. Isaac Newton comes in and he says that the reason I can see so far is because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And these giants are those that came before him, right? From the European civilization, from Islamic civilization, from the Hindu Indian civilization, from the Taoist Chinese civilization and Buddhist civilizations, and so on and so forth. All this knowledge is now getting summed up, and every civilization had a role to play to, accumulate and come to Europe. And Europe now is using this to be able to develop, right, science. And when science gets put into action, into industries, this is what the Industrial Revolution is, right? What we were mentioning in liberalism. But between the Industrial Revolution and Scientific Revolution, we have something that's really interesting. This is a Cartesian revolution, or René Descartes. René Descartes was this dude here. Interesting haircut. I probably wouldn't get it today. But René Descartes is not only famous for the Cartesian axis, right, XY axis, but he's also a great philosopher and a theologian. What he tried to do is he tried to prove God, and he tried to prove God through skepticism. Why skepticism? We see that as scientific revolution was taking place, and Copernican revolution took place, all of a sudden people had less trust for the government that was sponsored by the church. They had less trust on the church, right? The Catholic Church, because they themselves went through a Catholic Reformation period, a period just before Copernicus came into being, or, dropped his book. The church itself became extremely corrupt. And we can read this. If you went to a Catholic school, perhaps you didn't cover this in history, but there's the Reformation of the Catholic Church in the 14th century. So there was already a grave mistrust, and the Protestant movement comes out of that. Martin Luther from Germany comes out of that, and you have the different sort of Lutheranism and Protestantism and so on and so forth that comes out of the Catholic Church against Catholic Church. At the same time, science is now knocking on the door of the church system and tries to bury it, and it's getting its nails ready for the coffin. Cartesian revolution happens, which is quite interesting. René Descartes comes in, he tries to imitate or tries to prove that God exists. Now, what I'm going to do is, in a whiteboard, I'm going to quickly show you how last time, for example, we talked about, just make sure I saved it. We talked about essence and existence, right? Remember, there was this idea of essence and attributes. So essence is something that gives it its definition. Sorry, my bad. Right. And essence is what is really, it's the soul of the product. It's the heart of the product, right? And the essence, along with attributes being large, small, red, black, etc., creates what we call the existence of something, right? An iPhone, for example, has an essence, has attributes, etc., and we start to see this idea of existence. Essence, an idea of something, an existence. This is all to do with metaphysics. Remember, metaphysics. And then the understanding and studying metaphysics comes under knowledge, right? And what was the study of knowledge called? Epistemology. Yeah. So we can only study epistemology. We can only study, right, what we know. And the way we know something, we can only study and only know what exists. So metaphysics is the foundation of philosophy, and knowledge or epistemology comes after metaphysics, right? You can't study something that doesn't exist. Years ago, we couldn't study quantum computing. Quantum computing is a thing now because it's a discourse or a discipline that exists. If that's the case, right? Now let's go back to René Descartes. Descartes here is trying to prove that God exists. And he's saying, look, I'm going to do what everyone else does. Everyone's skeptical of religion. Let's start with skepticism. Yeah. Skepticism, I'm skeptical whether God exists. I don't know if God exists. But in order to prove that God exists, how do I even know that I exist? I mean, even before God exists, there must be this question, do I even exist to question God? And if that is the case, then what we need to do is to be able to actually understand and come to a conclusion that I actually exist. I don't know if I exist, but I'm definitely asking a question. That's what he says, right? I'm asking a question. And because I'm asking a question, well, there must be a questioner. I don't know what that question looks like. Maybe I'm in a dream and I'm thinking that I've got a body, I've got a crazy hairstyle and a mustache, and I'm wearing these, Three Musketeers clothing. Maybe in reality, I'm just a brain in a vat, right? I'm in a vat, and this is a brain that we have. Excuse my bad drawing. And then there are some electrical nodes or something that allows us to make us think and feel that we have a human body, right? Maybe we're stuck in a dream, but then you wake up from that dream, we're stuck in another dream, and so on and so forth. And the movie Inception touches on this point. This brain in a vat, what is reality? The Matrix touches on this point, right? Philosophical notions. So he's saying that I'm asking a question, and therefore there must be a questioner. And if there's a questioner, then, that I know, that much I know, that there is a questioner and I'm a thinking being. I have this ability to think, to ask the question. And so he says, I think, right? Therefore, I exist, right? I think, therefore, I must exist, because there must be a questioner to begin with. What happens here is his idea of his thinking. I think, therefore I exist, or I think, therefore I am. What happens is, to be able to think, to be able to know, this belongs in epistemology, right? And to exist and the study of existence, this belongs in metaphysics. So what he does is that he switches the whole element of metaphysics being number one and epistemology being number two. He flips that around. And now what we've got is epistemology is number one and metaphysics is number two. And this is what happens in the modern world. We're going to start seeing how epistemology then gets taken over by the scientific revolution and science. And those that are in metaphysics, for example, philosophy, that was considered the greatest subjects, and the study of religion, become relegated. And science actually starts to take over both religion and philosophy, even though science cannot prove or disprove religion or philosophy because it belongs in the realm of empirical knowledge. Quite interesting, right? Metaphysics to epistemology, and now it's switched. So modern philosophy and modern way of thinking, modern way of being is often to do with this idea, is to do with capitalism and consumption, accumulating money, making a career, having a great LinkedIn profile, right? All of these come together in the modern world. Let's go back to the slide pack. So we start seeing this, right? We start seeing the idea of the Industrial Revolution that has taken place as a result of the Cartesian Revolution. Now, all of a sudden, what we know, this idea of science, this idea of knowledge and putting it to practice from scientific revolution, we can start making money out of this. Yeah. And when we start making money out of the Industrial Revolution, then what happens is that we have this idea that government's taking everything from us. So we have the French Revolution, which starts off the idea of liberalism as the best way of organizing society, that liberal democracy is going to be the best political system. This didn't exist in history, right? Different civilizations use different ethical, political, philosophical ideas to shape their society. The French Revolution becomes a big area. And as the markets are growing and people are producing more, they need more resources. Where do the resources come from? Europe is only a tiny place. They need to come from other countries. And this is where colonies start. This is where, we go to other countries, we take their land, we take their resources, we use their labor, right? In order to create an economic system that is reliant and profitable. So when we look at America, for example, 500 years deep in cotton money as a result of slavery, as a result of not paying any wages, you're going to have a very rich economy. We look at the ways. There's a book by Walter Rodney. It's called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We all say, oh, okay, well, Africa's underdeveloped, sub-Saharan Africa. Well, actually, it was the policies of the Europeans. When the Europeans got there, the Africans were not underdeveloped. As a matter of fact, some of the African countries were the richest in the world at the time, right? Same with India. The literacy rates in India were much higher before British colonialism. So when we start seeing the effect of imperialism, colonialism justified through racism, and the economic trade that takes place, this shapes 1700s, 1800s, all the way through 1900s. And it becomes quite interesting because in the 1900s, all of a sudden, you start to see, in the early 1900s, you start to see a lot of globalization, not a lot of strict borders. People were traveling back and forth. People were trading. Imperialism, colonialism, racism also gets justified through science, right? We talk about Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory. They also say, well, if it's about survival of the fittest and it's about evolving and evolution, then people such as Europeans who are well evolved and far more evolved than any other people in the world actually are superior. Scientifically, they're superior. Objectively, genetically, they're superior. And because of their superiority, they can use certain people. They can kill off certain people. There was a theory by historians at the time of, say, 1800s, 1900s in Australia, which said, it was called the doomed race theory of the Indigenous Aboriginal communities. If we were to wipe them out, it would actually make society better, because the way we construct societies, the way we construct our economy would allow the dying races to die out and would actually speed up or expedite the process of evolution. And so human beings can come up with this ideal, sort of race, if we can call it that. And they were saying that they were intellectually, physically superior. They were the ones that were controlling shapes of beauty, so that people who were colonized would start hating their own skin color, the shape of their own noses, their hairstyles, their sense of fashion and architecture, and so on and so forth. So you had this colonial legacy that existed. At the same time, we start to see how, different scientific endeavors, phrenology, craniology, the study of craniums, to shape, the way people are. We start to see how botany, the way that plants were studied, they were said, okay, no, indigenous plants are not as superior to English roses. And so they brought with them their own animals, they brought with them their own plants, and destroyed the entire native ecosystem that had produced much more droughts, for example, right? So we go on from here and we start to see the 20th century. How are we going with time? Should I stop here or continue? Everyone okay? Continue?
Yeah, keep going, man.
Only a few more slides. Okay, cool. So this eventually, I think maybe for the lack of complete time, we can actually touch on the Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution of the 1920s. But in the early 1900s, we start to see this great growth, right? And the entire world was being cut up into different societies and civilization. The Italians, for example, had parts of, Libya, they had parts of Somalia, the French had West Africa, New Caledonia, the British had so much, right? And the whole world, like the Belgians had Congo, the Germans had Namibia, and the whole world was being cut up into different ways and different political systems and languages that existed. The first concentration camp wasn't during the Holocaust Nazi concentration camp, but the Germans actually trialed and tested a very remarkably effective one in Namibia, in West Africa, prior to leading to the Second World War. So when we start to see this happening, we then have a First World War in 1914, right, to 1917. When we have this sort of First World War from 1914 to 1917, it becomes really interesting because all of a sudden these great empires are against each other, killing each other for what they're doing, and copying each other at the same time. So as First World War happens, maybe I can just go sort of writing the whole thing. It'll just be easier if we go this way. World War One, where are we? World War One happens, the whole world gets destroyed, right? And as the world gets destroyed, we need to rebuild it. Every time the world gets destroyed and we need to rebuild, there are always extreme ideologies that come out because the majority of the voters are fed up with the government that has gone into war. Extreme ideologies have come out, and there are certain revolutions that take place, right? So as the 1920s come in, this is called the Roaring 1920s. Why? Because the whole world is completely devastated, and whenever you rebuild everything, you make a massive amount of profit. Money goes up. There are a lot of jobs available. American Empire State Building, the entire, music industry, jazz comes out. Culturally, economically, it's like the whole world is roaring. Yeah. The Shabirzin, it's interesting. So the whole world is now.
Battle of the Titans. You make sure to pull him up if he slips.
That's hilarious. So the Roaring 20s is happening, and the economy is overheating, right? Around the same time, we start to see these ideological figures rise, right? The rise of Stalin, for example, and the rise of Trotsky, and the rise of Lenin, and those that are behind the Bolshevik Revolution. Bolshevik Revolution, right? That are happening. We also see similar things happen later on in China, the Cultural Revolution, which is also this idea of, all of this is an idea of sort of Marxist concepts that, excuse my bad handwriting and my technological failure, Marxist concepts to eventually go from capitalism to socialism to communism. Yeah. Michael, do you want to explain some of this, the Russian one?
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but how I contextualize this for myself is that both Russian and French revolutions were attempts in different ways to resolve the issues that arose out of class stratification. You discussed earlier with feudalism how there was a set class structure that obfuscated people from moving within classes, and that the lower class, and for Marxists, that would be called the proletariat, are being exploited essentially by the factory owners and upper classes, the rich, or in Marxist terms, the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie. And in the French Revolution, excessive tax led to ultimately the frustration and perhaps a declining willingness to reconcile tradition and how things had been before with the day-to-day practicalities of their life, and which is a fancy way of saying they were too poor to eat. So that led in the French Revolution to these ideas of liberty, fraternity, equality, and the idea, and also within that, you mentioned earlier that these liberal ideas express themselves economically through capitalism and free market capitalism, and this idea of meritocracy, which is essentially that the market will decide your value. Whatever you contribute to society, you will make certain money, and the rich will be rich because of a reflection of how hard they worked. Whereas before, you'd work really hard and you couldn't get anywhere because that was just the class system. And the classic liberalist worldview is summarized by William Sumner, who said the drunken in the gutter is exactly where he ought to be. And then over on the Russian Revolution, similarly, the Tsars, which were the kings of Russia, they're still in this kind of feudal system, or at least this monarchical system, which disenfranchise and disaffect the poor. And so there was the storming of the Winter Palace where the Tsar lived, and the overthrowing of that system by the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, to establish socialism. And socialism is basically communism with the training wheels on. So there is still a central authority that assists in the transition to communism, at which point there'll be a decentralization of power and people will essentially share. The bootmaker will make his boots, and he'll make the boots for the children of the farmer who makes the apples, and they'll all just trade, and that's how communism will be. Socialism historically has been incredibly bloody. Mao Zedong in the Chinese transition to capitalism killed, I think, 72 million people. For context, Hitler did 12. I shouldn't say did, that's terrible. But so yeah, these revolutions have been attempts to try and rectify the issues of class stratification. Communism and socialism attempted to do that by decentralizing authority and getting rid of money, essentially. or at least in communism, so that they could share. Whereas democracy and the liberalism and the French Revolution and the West, they went about it by saying, no, we'll have free market capitalism and you can decide your own value. And this led to this kind of dichotomy over the last century between democracy and the evangelical Christian notion in America that if you just bomb brown people hard enough, you'll find liberal democracy underneath, and then trying to do that, versus the spread of the Reds. So Russia, so the Soviet Union with Stalin, Mao Zedong, Chinese Communist Party, Pol Pot in Cambodia, and the spread of communism. It's called the domino effect. You knock over one domino and it'll spread and it'll spread. And that's why we got America coming across to Vietnam in the Vietnam War to stop it. It got to northern Vietnam and we didn't want it to go any further south to Australia and such. So that's why America came in to the Vietnam War. So the last century has been characterized in large part by these two competing ideologies, which, mind you, you need to be careful not to say that anyone is better or worse. Marx and Engels, the creators of the Communist Manifesto, came up with a great ideology. It hasn't worked very well yet, but in theory, it's beautiful. And all these different ideologies about how to govern and manage people were various attempts to think of how to maximize and unleash human potential and create societies in such a way that we're maximizing human potential. And so you can see how your initial assumptions about how to appraise human potential, for example, within socialism, that it's justifiable to kill a bunch of people to get to socialist communist utopia, versus a Western mindset who focus on liberalism, or the individual as the central unit of importance, and killing is unjustifiable. You see how these kind of subtle ways that you go about looking at the world lead to very large differences, and indeed war, over the past century. And so what I want you guys to take away from this is how the ways that you initially go about, essentially that most people want good and think that they're doing good. You know, the terrorist, has egregiously misunderstood religious doctrine, but nevertheless, you can understand how a terrorist, through their worldview, can see America and the mass killing and the paganism and the fornication and all the way that they're going about the world. You can see how they're trying to make the world a better place by getting rid of that. And you can see how Hitler, for example, was possibly over-enthusiastic about radical eugenics, which is the branch of science that says that we can selectively breed humans to improve the human race, and obviously went about it in a really bad way. But if you appreciate that generally people think that they're doing the right thing, but come into confrontation with one another based on how they variously appraise the world, whether it's through a socialist lens, a collectivist lens, an individualist lens, a liberalist lens, and what happens when these people, both well-intentioned, come together, is what we see. That is the story of the past century. So it's good to characterize, or try not to characterize people in good and bad dichotomies, but see how people are motivated to try and make the world better. See how these political ideologies variously attempt to make the world better, make societies better. But due to a range of factors and people and all sorts of things, and history and circumstance, achieve that to, varying levels of success. Yeah, that's the end of what I wanted to say on that. So that was a bit of a tangent, but
thank you, Michael. In addition to that, I just wanted to highlight something that were being discussed, that when we look at some of these ideas, they don't necessarily are inherently good or evil, right? And that's important for us to understand. For example, during the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, there were a bunch of Marxists that were completely unhappy with the way that Russia was, or Soviet at that time, Soviet Union was going about killing people. So they said, where is the human, sort of face of Marxism? And the critical theory crowd that comes out of this is actually a Marxist angle that looks at the disappointments of the Trotskyists and the Leninists and how they're actually killing everyone. So if you want to look at critical theory, for example, they talk about this, where they look at that the human being is not necessarily just about, rational maximizer of self-interest that liberalism calls human beings to be. We're also emotional beings. We want happiness. We have a psychology within us. We have a particular economic system where we want to be able to create equalities and fairness, right? This is what socialism is fundamentally about, and Marxist idea of, Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital is about. And they also have a particular metaphysical worldview, right, that comes out of Hegel. When we look at terrorists, for example, the study of terrorists, well, anyone who defended their own land was considered a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was on the terror watch list in America until 2008, right? So we need to understand who defines what a terrorist is, what is terrorism, what is not terrorism, and the political language of the way we use these terms, right? So somebody defending a land, someone comes to take over your house, are you allowed to defend? Are you allowed to shoot? What if it's a foreign government? If China comes and attacks us and takes over into Australia or England, are we allowed to defend ourselves? If we do, then are we terrorists? Because that's what people in Afghanistan did. That's what people in Iraq did. Most of the ones in ISIS were actually people who lost their jobs out of the Iraqi army, right? Somebody had to pay them. So there is a rational motivation behind economics that goes on. When we talk about these evil figures like Hitler and Stalin and others, well, what about Winston Churchill? Winston Churchill bombed in one night in Dresden, 200,000 civilian population. What did the German kids do at that time? They didn't do anything, yet they're paid with their life, right? Winston Churchill was behind some of the great famines in India, in Bengal. Some of them estimates between 6 million to 30 million people died. The Holocaust was 6 million. This is 5 times the Holocaust. This is Winston Churchill. Yet today we see a Twitter. I was just on Twitter and I was watching Priti Patel, the Home Minister or the Minister of Immigration in England, praising Winston Churchill. So it becomes quite an interesting world, you know, when you start to realize what's actually happening and what happened beyond, you know, we don't know the history of our own cities, the land on which we're on, right? There's a suburb here in Melbourne called Narrewarren. It's in the southeast. One of the greatest genocides took place in Narrewarren. Yeah, Narrewarren in the local language means the meeting place. Meeting place. So one day, a couple of cops came as a retribution for one of the cops that died. Victorian police wiped out an entire mob, families, grandparents, children, grandchildren, about not longer, 90 years, maybe 100 years ago. So, we need to be able to be aware of the local history that is around us, right, as well. Let's try to rush through that. We are now almost there. We're in 20th century, so we're going to finish soon, I hope. So from the 1920s and 1920s, I think it was not this screen, but it was the whiteboard that I wanted to share. So at the 1920s, you have a huge growth, right, money-wise. And in 1929, you have the Wall Street crash, which is a huge crash where people lost their entire life savings and suicides were at a high level. Right? People literally killed themselves because they lost their life savings and there was no big government to protect them, right? And this really sort of rose to the Great Depression in the 1930s. And once again, whenever you have economic crises, whenever you have huge problems in the economy, wars and things like that, you go to extreme ideologies, right? And this allowed the Nationalist Socialist Party, the National Socialist Party in Germany, otherwise known as Nazis, to rise up. And they rose up with a particular ideology of fascism and sort of Nazi ideology. Benito Mussolini from Italy was also part of that. And this really led to World War II. Now, because the entire world was divided into colonies as a result of colonialism, everyone partook it. Yeah, you had to fight because you were under the French Empire in West Africa, you're under the British Empire in India, British Empire in Australia, and so on and so forth. So we start to see how all these play a part and they all affect one another. By the time World War II ends, right, it becomes a really interesting world, right? Holocaust happens. What was the Holocaust really? It was about Hitler doing to the rest of Europe what Europe has done to the rest of the world, right? Colonialism, coming up with Michael mentioned eugenics, yeah, eugenics. Eugenics at the early, like all this period here, this was a journal published science. You could get a PhD in eugenics, right? Which is how do you create genetically superior human beings? Right. It's actually, you look at the history of scientific journals, we say science is, it's objective. It's not really associated with value. It's about truth. What is There's a famous line that science, the amazing thing about science is that it's true, whether you believe in it or not, right? It's one of the memes that I saw. And it becomes interesting because when we start believing in this idea really comes from Darwinian evolution and what's called social Darwinism, right? Eugenics come into place, the idea of genocide, creating an entire gene pool that comes into it. And that has been happening for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Then we wonder, why is, Africa poor as a continent? Why is Asia rising? And why can't they do certain things, right? Why can't they have certain political powers that make sense? So at the end of World War II, it becomes quite an interesting place. All this time, we went from, excuse me as I stop the screen share and move to the other screen share. All this time, we went from an ancient worldview. Where are we here? I'll just move this around. All this time, we went from a particular ancient worldview. I don't know why this is not working. Sorry. We went from an ancient worldview where in antiquity, we had an objective reality. God was in the center of our ideas. It was a God-centric worldview. Religion dictated how we would live, what we would do, who we would marry and how we would marry them, what sort of family values we have, the law, the society, everything was God-centric. This is the sort of objective reality where metaphysics is in the middle. But in the modern world, we shifted, replaced God with mankind, right? Man meaning human being, right? So modernity is this objective subject that we have. It's not an objective reality of metaphysics anymore, but a human being. So the famous philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, says God is dead. What does that mean? He says God is dead. It is man who has killed God. It is this idea of that self-centered individual that is now able to measure values and ethics and come up with their own realities, right? That we are the ones where we've swapped epistemology for metaphysics. And now it's about knowing, it's about using our reason and using our scientific knowledge to be able to come up with this notion of enlightenment. And this modern enlightenment can create secular societies devoid of any religion, right? And this is what European modernity exported to the rest of the world. They killed people, they reconstructed societies, and we created this idea of a grand narrative where human beings or humanism was able to flourish. And over time, we're going to be dissolving this grand narrative, this narrative to make sense of the entire world. So when we go through that and we start to see what modernity is, we then finish Second World War. And when we finish Second World War, an organization by the name of League of Nations get created, right? That eventually become United Nations. And United Nations becomes a body where we say, okay, never again. We don't want wars. We don't want this. We don't want that. And people are upset. Yeah, people are upset about what was happening at that time, that we want to be able to create a civilization that is going to be solid now. We're not going to really believe in what was already there. What I mean by there is, let me just save this and clear the page. When we have a God-centric worldview to a man or a human being-centric worldview, we have law, society, economy and money, our understanding of history, art, etc. Everything is shaped by God. Now it's being shaped by man. But at the end of World War II, we said, look what we did. Yeah, look what we did. Human beings were able to come up with science. And science came up with Darwinian evolution and social Darwinism. It came up with Einstein's theory of E is equal to mc squared. And this wiped out a generation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Atomic bomb that eventually ended the war. But look what we did to do it. What is the price we paid? We're killing ourselves. It's not this idea of modernity that science can answer all the questions of the world, etc. But really, it's this idea that the human beings don't know best. We don't know best. Science can't necessarily end famines. It's about policy. We can make things scientific, like economic scientific, but fundamentally, we don't have a way of understanding the world. Why? Because if we live in a world of scientism, which is this idea, it's an ideology that believes that science can answer everything, right? If we live in this world of scientism, that we can only believe in 5 senses and somehow rely on some aspects of logic and rationality, can come up with computer programs, etc., then all we can testify is what we can see, taste, touch, hear, smell. But in reality, this objective knowledge cannot make any claims for aesthetics, for beauty, or ethics, value, what is good, what is bad. We don't know. Science can't give us that. This may rely on relative answers, subjective answers. Yeah. So we go from a society that is built on a God-centric world to a scientific or a human being-centric world.
From one point to another through material. All right, so
right, to a worldview where there is a void. And this is what postmodernism is. Postmodernism is the ideology behind the postmodern society, just like modernism is an ideology behind the modern society. And what is postmodernism? And what is the difference between modernism and postmodernism, or the modern society and the postmodern society? Let's have a look. In the modern age, the society was based on production. Karl Marx talks about fair and just production. Postmodern age is about consumption, what we can consume, what we can buy. Modern age is about community life, going to church, having, our grandparents' generation, for example, pre-Second World War, having certain community life. Postmodern individuals about fragmentation, individualism, one-bedroom apartments, studio apartments where you live by yourself, right? And you have friends through online gaming, through the internet. Modern age is about social classes, right? There was a saying in England, for example, that, he married up or she married up in a social class. Today, your identity is taken from other sources. These identities can be from your politics, to the way you look, to subcultures, to gender, and so on and so forth, right? Modern age is about family, right? 1950s, there's a father who sits at the head of the table and makes a prayer before they eat, etc. Postmodern age is about families. There are many options to have a family. It's a breakdown of the nuclear family and the creation of more individual families. Like, can you be a family individually? Can you be a family with multiple partners, right? We're seeing a very different ethical value system that is changing. A belief in continuity and situation, a continuity of knowledge that has taken place, that we can see so far, as Isaac Newton says, is because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Postmodernism don't look at them as giants anymore. They say, no, their knowledge is rubbish. We don't even know what's true anymore, right? There's a breakage with the past and tradition. The role of education that existed in the modern age was through a schooling system. We had the liberal arts that looked at grammar, logic, rhetoric, right? Looked at astronomy and acoustic and mathematics. Today, it's an education for what? And this is what I'm saying. The university is in demise. Education's for careers, for vocation. We don't educate people for intellectual curiosity and to be real virtuous, living the virtuous life, the good life that Aristotle and Socrates talks about. It's gone. We're now looking for ways that we can educate ourselves to get a better degree, to get a better LinkedIn profile, to get a higher income. That's really what purpose has become. Yeah. A one-way media used to exist where radios, the wireless, or you can say the TV used to be able to portray what was the media. Today, we don't even have duality of media. Duality of media started with talkback radio. We have multiple mediums. Right? YouTube, you start your own news. News today shows amateur footage taken on their phones, right? You can start your own channel, your news channel, right? Media, there's a complete decentralization of it. There's an overt social controls in the modern age, where in society, there are certain decorum, there are certain outfit that you wear. A man never leaves a house without wearing a hat, right? A woman never left without covering their hair, for example. In the postmodern age, we start to see there's a covert control of human behavior, CCTV, over surveillance, right? That is happening today. What's interesting is we say that, okay, we want less government intervention, right, in late capitalism, or as we call it, neoliberalism, right, which is this idea of the end of liberalism or the end of capitalism. We want less government, but there's no need for government anymore because they're watching everything that you do. Everything that I'm saying now is being recorded and being posted somewhere. It may be in Arizona, wherever it is. Governments have access to this knowledge that's there, right? We're going into the bionic age, the age where human beings will be implanted with chips, right? We're going to live in the metaverse, so on and so forth. So all of this will be recorded. Nationhood, nation states, we had an identity of what it meant to be English, what it meant to be French. Today, look at the French soccer team, right? Or English cricketers, and see the diversity that's there. We live in a global monoculture. This multiculturalism that exists everywhere becomes monoculture. You go to Singapore, the identity has changed, right? You go to Mumbai in India, you're watching MTV and listening to Western music just as much as you're listening to Indian music, having Indian food. Science aided progress and finding according to the modern age. Science had a centric sort of value, and it was able to find the truth. Today, science is only one source of knowledge amongst many sources of knowledge. I see that the younger generation today, for example, those who are in high school or just coming out of high school, actually believe a lot in astrology. That wasn't there when I was growing up, right? People used to laugh at astrology, but now that sort of, language is coming back in again. I'm getting in touch with my inner goddess, for example, right? So there's a multiplicity of truths that are here. Modern age was about structure, was about security, it was about place and stability. You knew who you were. You knew your own identity. You were confident in that. Today, there's a confusion. There's a lack of structure. There's an incessant choice, right? You create who you want to be, right? You create your own identity. And this becomes really interesting in postmodern age. And we can see this as the sort of hallmarks of what postmodernism is. From 1950s onwards today, everything becomes relative. Even science becomes relative, right? Science went from Newtonian physics, where the laws of physics would dictate the truth, to Einstein's theory of relativity, where time and our understanding of reality was relative, to quantum mechanics, where reality, the way we view the world, constructs as reality. There is no metaphysics anymore because it's our mind that creates the truth, so-called. Right? So science itself has become postmodern and is not able to come up with truth. Skeptical interpretation on culture, on literature, on art, on philosophy. This becomes really interesting for me, right? Why does it become interesting? Look at the way that in the past, the role of the author was big when it came to reading a book. It was about Charles Dickens. It was about Shakespeare and what Shakespeare was saying. Today, if it's about postmodernism, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I'm the one that creates meanings. Then I can create a truth by the book that I read, and it doesn't matter what the author says. So somebody can read the Quran, which has a backing of 1400 years of rigorous intellectual scholarship, just like the Bible and others, but they can read their own interpretation and own ideas and go and, they can read a Bible and blow up an abortion clinic in Texas, or they can read the Quran and blow up innocent people in a suicide attack. So this postmodern idea of the subject creating the truth becomes extremely dangerous and problematic, and is a product of Western modernity, and it's a product of Western postmodern identity, right? Beyond the philosophy and the art and the history. And we'll look at some, ideas. There's no objective truth anymore and everything is subjective. Look at the way, for example, we start seeing, I don't think we have time for this. I'll share this quantum physics, how, the eye sort of creates the truth, whether it's a particle or a wave, particle wave duality. I'll share this on Facebook. But look at the way, for example, we've gone into this sort of dissolving this grand narrative. We went from a God-centric worldview to a man or a human being-centric worldview where man has killed God. And now it's absolutely a void. It's the eye that creates meaning. It's the beauty that is in the eye of the beholder, right? Everything is subjective. Everything is relative. There is no virtue anymore because we can't really study it. There's no beauty anymore because it's all about what we create. Look at the way ancient art was. Ancient art always told a narrative, a story. This is almost like a two-dimensional ancient Egyptian painting talking about metaphysical values, right, of the other world. It's talking about religion, a God-centric worldview. We change that with the modern period and modern art, where human beings are the center of the entire sphere of our universe, and human beings are perfectly proportioned. And this idea of humanism that flourished comes out of this man-centric universe. And paintings that were painted in the modern period shows this depth of perception that wasn't there in the ancient Egyptian paintings, for example. Things that are further away are much smaller. Things that are closer are much bigger. Why? Because we're viewing the entire world through the eyes of the observer, the human being. The human being is the center, right? And it's how the human being sees the world. That's how we portrayed the painting. Then we'll start looking at postmodern art, theory of relativity. Time is relative, right? It's liquid modernity or liquid times that we live in, where everything is fluid, right? Time is fluid. Our ethics are fluid. This is a scene from Inception, if you've seen the film. They're saying that this is how the seventh dimension would look like. We live in a three-dimensional world and time being a fourth dimension. This is the seventh dimension. At the end of the film, Christopher Nolan, who makes the film, says, well, this is actually a reflection of our own self, and we created this seventh dimension. It's about this void and the I, this void that creates this reality. This is the very first postmodern art in the early 1900s or 1917 to be, in fact. If art was about beauty, Marcel, I forget his full name, Marcel the artist, came out with a men's urinal, turned it upside down, wrote Mut and 1917 on it, and called it art. Because, well, there is no beauty anymore, right? Everything is as it is. And this is this nature of postmodern world. Have a look at this meme. These glasses that were left on the floor of San Francisco Museum of Modern Art were treated as a postmodern art masterpiece. People started taking photos. They thought this was art. What does this mean? Right? Visitors in the museum were confused. Meanwhile, the great classics are like, what the hell is going on? So this meme is saying modern art is shit. The classics are amazing, right? I always find this really funny because there's no meaning anymore. We don't understand what reality is. We don't understand what truth is, right? Science is subjective. Everything else is subjective. Yet we try to make moral claims like laws exist, like something is beautiful, like, who defines the dictates the definition of beauty. So in the 1950s, we see books being written by someone like Jean-Paul Sartre. This is this idea of existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy that it's not about the essence anymore. It's not about metaphysics anymore. It's about existence, and existence comes prior to essence. Essence is what gave us the definitive qualities, essence and attributes. Really, it's about existentialism and the idea of what's called an experience or a phenomena, phenomenology, right? Which Heidegger, and before Heidegger, his teacher starts. But once we're looking at this, he writes a book called Being and Nothingness, i.e. we exist and there's nothing else to it. For a complete butchery of his book, and may Jean-Paul Sartre forgive me for that. But it's this existence prior to essence, and really it's about the self-centered world of subjectivity, and that's all we have. We want to be individualistic. We want to be self-centered in many ways. We don't like it when we turn up to a wedding or a year to a formal and we're wearing the same dress as someone else, or wearing the same suit or driving the same car as someone else. We want to be different. We want to assert our authority and our subjectivity in the world. We want to make our profiles stand out. We want the most amount of likes on social media, right? This is the world that we have created, constructed, the world we live in. This is the age of the self, or the selfie, right? Hillary Clinton is waving and everybody's taking selfies here. You may know this gentleman by Kanye West. He says, I'm thankful for myself for being myself, right? Imagine that's a quote, a proverb on the GAMSAT. I'm thankful for myself for being myself, because we often are creators as our own identity. This notion of being and ontology and existence is really my own construct or my own creation, right? So we went through, and I'm pretty happy the fact that we stopped here. I'll stop here. I think we did a pretty good job to be able to finish here. And we went through antiquity to postmodernism. It's 8:40. Oh, I thank you. It's like watching a 5-setter in the Australian Open, right? So I really thank you for your time, and please let's open it up for questions, comments that you can send through as well later on if you want to watch it again. I'll stop speaking here.
I might shortly start. I might end the recording and we could just have 3 questions. If you guys didn't see me hustling in the chat, which I'm sure you did, but I'm going to remind you anyway, please, please leave us a review. I started up Google reviews this morning, and reputation is everything. And 90 Plus was started, in fact, because I had 7 tutors, and it was really hard to learn who was, without knowing myself, who was giving the right information and who wasn't. And more often than not, I got the wrong information. And having reviews there allows people to, whether you think good or bad of us, at least make informed decisions, which I think there's a paucity of in the GAMSAT scene. And I'd like people to be able to have more criteria to make their decisions on how to invest their time, because time is a precious resource in GAMSAT. So anyway, if you think there's value in it, there's a link in the chat, or just Google 90 Plus and leave your thoughts. I'll end the recording. Thanks, Nosh. And then we'll do some free questions.